Before opiates were prohibited, simple labeling had already cut their sales by a third. Alright, so the public's ignorance about the addictive properties of opium and opium derivatives was the main cause of addiction in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Once the public was made aware of the dangers and labeling requirements were in place, the 33% dip in sales was pretty clear evidence that more people were worried about their health than chasing a high. Alright, now we're about to get our hands dirty. Just for the record, what I am about to read makes me extremely uncomfortable. The Pacific Standard article continues. There were certainly concerns about addiction linked to the over-the-counter sales of drugs like cocaine and opium, but this was not the focus of the debate over the Harrison Act. In the early 1900s, the typical opiate addict was a white housewife who bought her drugs ostensibly as medicine, and yet the media spotlight mainly fell on black and Chinese males. Quote, "Most of the attacks upon white women of the South are the direct result of the cocaine-crazed Negro brain," testified one doctor in congressional hearings aimed at drumming up support for the proposed law. A 1908 feature from the New York Times was headlined, "The Growing Menace of the Use of Cocaine." It stated that cocaine is, quote, "the most insidious of known narcotics, a drug that wrecks its victim more swiftly and surely than opium." The same 1908 New York Times article also claimed, quote, "The use of coke is probably much more widely spread among Negroes than whites. Heaven dust, they call it. Its use by Negro field hands in the South has spread with appalling swiftness and results. There is very little doubt that every Jew peddler in the South carries the stuff, although many states have lately made its sale a felony." A 1905 New York Times story headlined, "Negro Cocaine Evil," quoted a Memphis judge who claimed that, quote, "The evils attendant upon the use of the drug cover the whole catalog of crime." A constant diet of this type of media coverage increased support for state and federal prohibition laws, although statistics did not show heavier use of cocaine by blacks compared to whites. But it wasn't just blacks and Jews who were the object of this prejudice. Fear and hatred of the Chinese workers who built the transcontinental railroads and were later seen as threats to American workers also played a role. Journalists and editors stoked fears that opium allowed or encouraged quote-unquote Chinamen to rape or seduce white women. Indeed, the same doctor who testified to Congress that cocaine led blacks to sexually assault white women also told the legislators and press that, quote, "In Chinatown, in the city of Philadelphia, there are enormous quantities of opium consumed, and it is quite common, gentlemen, for these Chinese, or chinks as they are called, to have a concubine, a white woman." Clearly, our anti-drug laws were not then, and are not now, based on science. What's worse, their racist impact remains considerable. Michelle Alexander notes in the book The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, that biased enforcement of drug laws means that more black men are under criminal justice supervision today than were enslaved in 1850. And although blacks and whites use and deal drugs at comparable rates, African American men are sent to prison for drug crimes at a rate that is 10 times higher, according to the NAACP. As Alexander puts it, "We have not ended racial castle in America. We have merely redesigned it." Another lesson of the Harrison Act involves the media. It was not, and remains, too credulous about non-scientific claims made about drugs and too willing to spread stereotypes and propaganda. Over the past century, if the New York Times and other publications had simply searched their own archives during each new wave of drug panic, they would have found repeated instances of different drugs alternately being called, quote, "the most addictive ever" or not, depending on whether there was a current crusade against them, rather than on new comparative medical evidence. You know, today there is clearly a reinvigorated crusade against opioids. As a chronic pain patient for over 23 years, I know for a fact that chronic pain does not discriminate. It does not check off little boxes such as gender, age, yearly income, race, religion, sexual identification, political alignment, married or unmarried, vegan or meat eater, dog lover, cat lover, employed, military veteran, or the many other boxes we check to prejudge a person or persons instead of looking at the content of one's character. All those little societal and cultural boxes I just mentioned, and many others, mean nothing. At the same time, they mean everything. Those boxes, when checked, are what gives us culture, what makes us human, and they are what gives humanity its diversity. But they are also used as tools to tear us apart. Humans have created untold amounts of pain by slaughtering millions upon millions of people because of race or religion alone. Unlike humanity, which often only sees little boxes to check, pain only sees victims. Last episode, I played this clip from MSNBC's Morning Joe.
Heroin, remember when we were growing up, heroin is what people on the outskirts of society in the worst parts of New York City did, and that was supposed to be taken care of, and drugs got lighter, and kids were just smoking pot and la. And now, boom, heroin. When I say just, that's not how I feel about smoking pot. Don't even get me started on the legalization of it. I just got now my son and all my friends are going to be angry at me.
Totally opposed. I'm with you, Joe.
But how did we jump to heroin?
I'll tell you how it started. It started in doctors' offices and hospitals and pharmaceutical companies all over this country. We consume 85% of the world's prescription opiates. 85%, we're 4% of the world's population. This is an epidemic here that was started by our physicians, by our hospitals, by our pharmaceutical companies. And that's what happened. And the fact is, if we don't get at that root of it, think about this. 4 out of every 5 heroin addicts today in America started on prescription opioids.
Okay, let's be real here. I seriously doubt that the Morning Joe does his own research. But his team of researchers could have easily found information showing that Christie's statement was bunk. It took me a few Google searches and a total of about 5 minutes to start punching holes in the false narrative that 4 out of 5 new heroin initiates started their addiction with a prescription from a doctor. But this narrative has been repeated ad nauseum by countless politicians and the media in recent years. Clearly, the media in the 20th century accepted whatever BS they were fed by government officials. Over 100 years later, nothing has changed. We cannot count on the media to tell our story. And we can't count on the federal government to protect our rights as long as the words chronic pain are one of the boxes that are checked. Today we learned that the Harrison Anti-Narcotic Act was the first federal law that criminalized the non-medical use of drugs. We also learned that it was the first shot fired in a 100+ year war on drugs that was based on a racist agenda. Making things worse, the medical community was immediately targeted upon the Harrison Act becoming law. In the next episode, episode 4, we learn how the war on drugs was used by the Nixon administration to oppress blacks and the anti-war left to win re-election. And by the way, Nixon's re-election was one of the biggest landslide political victories in our electoral history. That alone is proof that the war on drugs is much more effective as a political weapon than a means to protect the health of this great nation. Speaking of episode 4, we also look at the drug legislation backed by every United States president, from Theodore Roosevelt in 1901 to present day. The purpose is to study the cultural evolution of the war on drugs after its clearly racist founding. We also discuss the impact of the war on drugs on the doctor-patient relationship over the last 100+ years. Okay, folks, I'm going to conclude today's episode with a preview of what we will discuss in episode 4. According to Professor Libby's 2005 policy analysis, the Harrison Narcotics Act was repealed in 1970, but it was replaced by the Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. The DAPCA, along with the 1975 Supreme Court ruling in the case U.S. v. Moore, reaffirmed the legality of the Harrison Act's criminalization of doctors who treat addicts by prescribing controlled pharmaceuticals. In Moore, the Supreme Court confirmed that physicians who are licensed by the Drug Enforcement Agency to prescribe narcotics under Title II of the DAPCA, called the Federal Controlled Substances Act, can be prosecuted when their activities fall outside of the usual course of professional practice. I'm going to say that again. They can be prosecuted when their activities fall outside of the usual course of professional practice. A doctor could be criminally charged with unlawfully prescribing or diverting highly addictive narcotic drugs that the DEA classifies as Schedule II controlled substances. Even though it was passed during a period of general drug tolerance, the Controlled Substances Act would prove to be a potent weapon in later years as the war on drugs intensified. In episode 2 of the Chronic Pain Survival Guide, I discussed how treating chronic pain is as unique as each patient's fingerprint. No two patients are alike. With that said, think back to what I just said about the DEA and doctors. Isn't successfully managing chronic pain the definition of activities that fall outside of the usual course of professional practice? Multiply that by the CDC's estimate of 50 million chronic pain patients, and we have a major problem. In episode 4, we also ask, who decides when a physician's activities fall outside the usual course of professional practice? The Surgeon General? A team of top pain management specialists? Well, the answer may surprise you. The answer may also help listeners understand why there is such a tense relationship between chronic pain patients and the medical community. But there is a catch. Listeners will have to wait until next episode to find out. Thank you for listening today, and tune in for episode 4. In the meantime, please rate and review this podcast on your listening app of choice, and rate and review us on social media. Visit us at facebook.com/The Chronic Pain Survival Guide, on Twitter at A Chronic Pain Pod, on Spreaker.com, SPREAKER.com, and search the site's podcasts for the keywords chronic pain. And finally, visit us on patreon.com/chronic pain, where you can rate and review this podcast, see bonus material, and more. Episode 3 of the Chronic Pain Survival Guide was a Melanie Martin production. This podcast was written, researched, edited, and hosted by Timothy J. Miller.
So